Well, I guess one thing I wanted to ask you is, suppose someone said, look, what's really happening here is that there are people who get married and they have, a stability gene, and they pass that along to their kids. So what you're really seeing isn't the benefit of marriage, it's the benefit of a certain kind of biological inherit. What do you say to that?
I think that it's certainly the case that some of the findings that we've been seeing with regards to family structure are really artifacts of some kind of genetic, thing. So if the mom had a risk, for depression, and then she ended up getting divorced, partly because she was more likely to be depressed, and her daughter is depressed, you might think that divorce causes depression, when in reality it was some kind of genetic risk that was passed from mother to daughter in that sense. And that seems to be part of the story in the family structure findings. But there is a lot more work being done today by people like Bob Emery at UVA and his colleagues with twins. And so they're able to look at adult twins where both sets of twins are getting married, and then they track their kids and see of those adult twins who gets divorced and how their kids turn out. And they can kind of figure out from that design that some of the effects that we're talking about today are related to genes, and some of them are a fact or a consequence, if you will, it looks like, based upon these models of the sort of the environmental effect of divorce on kids.
If you had to choose one study that you've either done or looked at that would really show people that this matters, and it can't be, it's not just easily explained away, that stable families with the parents in the home. Can you cite one or?
Well, I think a good paper that reviews a lot of this evidence in a very powerful way is by Sarah McClanahan, my mentor at Princeton, and some of her colleagues. It's a review piece on the sort of causal effects of father absence for children. So it kind of looks at a variety of studies and tries to assess how much of the impact of having a father absent from the home is having a causal impact on kids, and how much of the apparent sort of outcomes might be related to some other factors that that more sophisticated models are addressing. So that's a good, I think, article to kind of give to someone who's a little bit skeptical about all this.
I saw the other day after Prince died, they were doing little bios, and he'd been interviewed, and he told a story that his father had been a musician, but he wouldn't let little 3-year-old, 4-year-old Prince play the piano. And then he left, he abandoned them. And the piano was there, and the mother let him play. And apparently the reason the father wouldn't let him play was he said, "You're not good enough, you can't do it." So he wasn't particularly nice to him, then he abandoned him. And Prince became obsessed with this piano, of course became one of the great rock musicians of all time. And I found that story so poignant because it was clear, and it made me want to cry as a mother, that he had this heartbreak. He had this, I don't know, people who've been abandoned by their fathers describe just this empty space inside.
Sure.
You could see that in him. But you could also see what we were talking about, that his amazing, what it did is it, just turned him to this super achiever. Now that's not normal, but it was an example of, a kid, how much hurt he is, and then in his case.
And how some kids are, obviously Barack Obama is the child
we have
of
Barack
the
Obama,
mother.
we have Bill Clinton, we have George Washington.
Right. So I mean, it's, again,
I
the
think
point is
Aristotle and Plato lost their fathers.
So it can be kind of, a springboard for some to fight harder and do better. But I'm just saying that on average, and so we talk about individuals, but also we need to talk too about neighborhoods and communities, and how. So the story there is much, I think, much more straightforward. And so when you have communities with lots of absent fathers, the work of Raj Chetty at Stanford, this new economist there at Stanford who's moved from Harvard to Stanford, suggests that communities that have more single-parent families have less mobility for poor kids. So poor kids growing up in the Atlanta metro area, for instance, are less likely to make it into the upper class as adults, whereas kids who are being raised in the Salt Lake City metro area are much more likely to go up into upper class as adults. And one reason that's the case is that there are more two-parent families in the mix in the Salt Lake City metro area than there are in the Atlanta metro area. And so
you're controlling
he's controlling for a lot of, for other factors. It's not the only factor, again, but it's just one factor that he has noticed in his work on these patterns of economic mobility for poor kids that is, I think, quite suggestive. Or we can think of the work of Robert Sampson, a Harvard sociologist, and he has shown that one of the best predictors of violence at the community level is the share of single-parent families in a community. So again, if you're concerned about public safety, if you're concerned about economic mobility for poor kids, you need to think about how the village is constituted. And we've heard that it takes a village to raise a child, and I think that's true. But the point from this evidence, I think, is that a married village is more likely, to help kids thrive.
And I worry about young men in my research on boys who may live in a fatherless home and then goes to school where all the teachers are women and boys aren't the favored gender in most schools. They're sort of there on sufferance, and they're hype. They liked that rough and tumble play, and that goes on. And teachers and mothers are not nearly as female teachers and mothers are not nearly as tolerant and understanding of it as male, fathers and teachers. And I just worry about boys in growing up with and just seeing very few men. And then sociologists talk about hyper masculinity and boys who learn to show their manhood, not in ways which are socially productive. I mean, healthy men who evince healthy masculinity. They build things. They protect vulnerable people. Hypermasculine males do just the opposite. They destroy things and they prey on weaker people. And it appears that for young males, having either father figures, male teachers, mentors, this is critical. I mean, a lot of people understand this and are trying to bring that resource to boys. But we live at a time where people want to deny that there are differences between males and females. They want to deny that phenomena are going on, that there are boys at risk of this sort of pathological form of manhood. And there just seems to be so much politics that prevents us from trying new things, I happen to think it's going to be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. It's like when I talk to gender scholars and they have this vision of men and women becoming interchangeable, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get rid of masculinity and femininity. It's here to stay. And I think it's a fairy tale. But I also feel the way sometimes people talk about marriage that, we live in a society now where divorce is the norm, and a lot of people are living together before marriage, and it's just not clear to me that we will ever. That it's almost a fairy tale. That, however, having said that, both with the gender scholars, I say, okay, then do some reasonable things, that and make sure they're not harmful, because some of their ideas of making boys and girls alike seem to me to be. They just go too far, and it's almost like kind of trying to re-engineer children. It's not going to work, but it can make them quite unhappy. I don't think it's going to make people unhappy by, looking for ways to strengthen marriage and tell people, at least be honest about them, the risks that.
Exactly. Right.
So
yeah, I think the idea is that, marriage is not going to look in 2020 like it did in 1820, no matter what happens, but the question is, can we build a kind of a new marriage culture for the 21st century that acknowledges a lot's changed, that, that sort of is aware of the fact that, in most homes with married dads, dads are doing, much more childcare, much more housework than was the case, 50 years ago, and that's great. So how do we kind of create...
Still not enough.
How do we create a marriage culture
that won't happen either.
Where, that's taken into account, and where I think in particular with working class and poor families, we're able to see men's contributions not, only obviously in terms of the ability that they can bring money to the table, but also the way in which they might be great, coaches, great playmates, et cetera, for their kids. And I think, one reason why marriage is so fragile in working class and poor families is that we haven't yet developed enough of an appreciation for the distinctive role that dads play in the lives of their kids, and to recognize that, look, just because, dad may have lost his job or is having difficulty finding a job or is only working 20 hours a week right now, doesn't mean he can't play an important role in the life of the family, both now and 10 years down the road. So I talked to an African-American father, for instance, in the Atlanta area, and he had lost his job with, a telephone company, and his wife and daughter left. Because he was no longer able to provide for them financially. But I think we need to sort of understand that, he could provide in other ways,
Right.
to his daughter, practically and emotionally, and to appreciate that men's role extends beyond just their financial contributions to the family. I think that's the kind of thing we need to sort of build on and work on, I think, for kind of a 21st century marriage model.
And I remember reading in the sociologist David Blankenhorn, in his book on fatherlessness, he said, a father doesn't have to be perfect. You can be kind of an okay dad.
Sure.
And you can, watch too much football and, spend Saturday, whatever, watching the games and drinking beer and, roughhousing with your kids. You don't have to be always in touch with your feelings.
Sure.
And doing, and still you do that role. You don't have to be this, sometimes it seems like they've set this standard of fatherhood and most men think, I'll never do that.
Yeah.
For your kids, just being there.
Yeah.
And
being a good enough father is
a good enough father.
Yeah, is sort of the idea. I think that's something to sort of hold on to as well. Yeah.
But now I want to bring up a group of scholars. You've mentioned several researchers
Sure.
and their important findings on the need to stabilize families. But there's a group, I think you've called them, or others have, the family structure denialists. I'm thinking of, Stephanie Coons and Philip Cohen at University of Maryland, and I think even Vox was citing these, and other scholars had it looked very authoritative on, it's silly to say that we need to, that single families are unstable
kids,
or
yeah.
bad for kids.
Yeah.
And some of their arguments were interesting to me. Like, they pointed out that a lot of you and your fellow researchers have found that it puts kids at risk for violence and academic failure when the father's absent. However, today, if we look at the millennials, many who come from broken homes, they're allegedly, the data that I've seen, there are fewer teenage pregnancies or out-of-wedlock pregnancy. There are fewer, there are fewer teenage pregnancies. There's
Sure.
still a lot of
Right.
out-of-wedlock pregnancies. There's less violence,
Right.
and more kids are graduating from high school. So where's the evidence of,
Societal kind of,
social,
right, breakdown.
breakdown when the kids are all right, as the movie said.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think it's a great point that in some important respects and some outcomes, we're doing better now than we were, 20 years ago. So it does show us that fatherhood and that marriage are not the only factors that affect our kids. I think we've seen improvements in policing in the last 30 years. In some important respects, there's obviously still much to be done on that front. We have seen improvements, I think, in some ways in the educational sector. More kids are, and
people have fewer kids.
People have fewer kids. Parents are are more productive. There are obviously pros and cons to that. But there are these broader cultural and economic shifts that I think have helped, many kids flourish in important respects. But it's still the case that when you compare kids, whether they were born in 1970 as I was, or if they're born in 2000, as other kids obviously have been born, in intact married versus, say, a single mother household, there are these gaps. So and these gaps continue. And the scholars that you mentioned tend to be pretty concerned with inequality, and I think we have to appreciate the fact that for kids who are being raised in single parent homes, they are getting unequal parental attention, unequal parental resources economically,
and the outcomes are unequal. And it's
right,
not there
right.
for them.
So there's, the point that I would make is that kids would be doing that much better if there was more stability in our families, and if it wasn't so stratified. So when it comes to inequality, one of the most striking things that I have seen is the work of political scientist Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids, and he has a graph basically showing that the share of kids being raised in single-parent homes among less educated moms is growing, and the share of kids in single mother households when mom is college educated is actually declining since the mid-1990s. So the point I'm making here is that what's happening in our families vis-a-vis marriage and fatherhood and family stability is, I think, playing an important role in fueling this growing social and economic divide in America. So again, if we're concerned about equality and reducing social and economic inequality, we need to be thinking about ways to bridge this marriage divide and bridge this family divide that's emerging.
I have to agree with you, because even in my work about boys in school, what I saw and what I continue to see is that there's a cohort of boys who probably would have been okay in previous decades, because there was a time where you could graduate from high school, get a job at the local factory or something, and make it into the middle class. That is increasingly difficult. And there were researchers at Harvard Graduate School of Education that said that the new passport to the American dream is education beyond high school. And increasingly girls are getting it and boys are not. And especially boys from poor families, and especially single parent families, they are less likely than their sisters to find a place in the economy. Now, in England, in Australia, and Canada, they're very worried about this cohort of young men who are, they worry about their labor force, plus the personal lives of these kids. And so they're looking for ways to, I don't know that they're talking about family stability, but they are certainly paying attention to the education of these kids. I look at it and think that it's going to influence their ability to form families. That if it's not just that they're not going to find jobs, which is terrible, but they're going to find it very hard to get married and to form families. And so it seems to me we should be putting one thing I recommend is putting more resources into educating disaffected, academically disengaged young boys.
Right. That's a great point. I think David Autor has made this point as well. He's kind of talked about the way in which, when you sort of make the argument that we need dads, we need marriage to be stronger, working class and poor communities, many scholars, many journalists say, well, look, women don't have really great options with these guys, and what can they do? Well, and my point is, well, look, if that's where you kind of leave things, you're basically consigning a large share of the male population to this kind of vicious cycle where the dads are never married to the mothers, the boys never are raised at home with their father, and it just continues.
It just amazes me
this
that
pattern,
people would think that
cycle.
That was okay.
So,
it's all right. The men just aren't worth marrying.
Right.
Well,
so I think the challenge for us is how do we help working class and poor boys and men who are not on the college track, find their identities in terms of education and work. And I think we could do, a lot better when it comes to vocational education, for instance, and apprenticeship training.
In Australia, they did a major study of adolescents, and they asked boys from all social classes, but they were especially interested in disaffected, lower middle class, poor boys. And almost without exception, these kids said they were bored with their classes in high school. They just couldn't take it anymore. And they said, what would keep you in school? And they said, something that would help me get a job. And so we now have models of excellence in vocational education. It's not what voced was in, I don't know, in the 60s. It was a place to just, place kids that people thought were academically hopeless. But now these schools combined academics. I visited a high school called Aviation High School in Queens, New York. It's one of the most inspiring places in New York City, and it's in this gritty kind of section of Queens. You go in there, and the kids, they have to do well in their academic classes in order to take, tinker with I think they have a Cessna 411 or something out in the parking lot, and to tinker with that, you have to do well in your classes to take these other courses. So they work hard, and they can have academic careers, but they can have jobs in airplane mechanics, and some of them go on to become pilots. And they draw poor and working class kids from all backgrounds across New York City. And it's just such an obvious solution. But
right. Yeah.
And I just want to go back, because I have a couple of more questions from these critics. The family structure denialists, and they say, well, look at Europe. In Europe, here you are encouraging marriage because you say there'll be all of these unfortunate consequences. But in Europe, marriage is all over the world. It's increasingly less popular than it once was, or less common than it once was. But especially in Western Europe, it's becoming the norm. In France, I think, to have children out of wedlock. They don't appear to be suffering the social consequences. So maybe your looking in the wrong place. Maybe we should be, you know, using, you know, getting the same social programs they have, and that would solve the problem.
Well, it's certainly the case that a generous safety net, you know, can be helpful in minimizing, you know, any kind of economic impacts of single parenthood. But it's important to note that even in Europe, kids who are born to cohabiting parents is often the case, particularly in sort of, well, northwestern Europe, are still more likely to see, you know, their parents part ways by the time they turn 12 compared to kids who are born to married parents in places like France and Sweden and elsewhere. So what's interesting about marriage is that it's an institution, and it's not a Christian thing. It's a human thing, you know. So we see obviously marriage in China and India and Egypt and Europe. So, you know, and it's this thing that we've used across time and space to stabilize adult relationships and integrate typically dads in the picture on a longer term basis. And so, and to do so with, you know, with some rituals and some vows and some, you know, involvement of friends and family members and entry into this new state in your life.
Right.
And so, not surprising whether you're in Sweden or in Saudi Arabia or in China or in Colombia or in the United States or in Uruguay, you would tend to see more stability in families that are formed around marriage than families that are formed around other arrangements. I think that's an important.
Just the way you described it, so you see it as some sort of essential to a kind of, or a critical part of the human ecosystem, and
Yes.
throughout the world. And just as we learn that we have to certainly hesitate and ask questions before we just happily, you know,
Sure. Right.
take all the rivers and, oh, we don't need this system. Let's change the course of rivers. And then there's, you know, this unexpected ecological destruction. This can happen when human beings are too casual about dispensing with a tradition and institution, and so that's how you sort of how you.
It's obviously a kind of a Burkean view to some extent, but I mean the bigger point here simply is that there's a human ecology out there, and that, you know, when that human ecology breaks down, either at the family level or at the neighborhood level, as we've seen in many, you know, low-income communities here in the United States, for instance, you know, kids pay a big price for that. It looks like particularly boys pay a big price when the neighborhood is dysfunctional, when the families aren't being formed around two parents, et cetera. So there's I think an environmental piece to this that's important to be attentive to.
Well, I have a final question, and it goes back to my experience at Stanford when they were so unhappy when I talked about the need for fathers and family stability. It occurred to me that maybe, well, for one thing, is maybe they thought I was being judgmental. Maybe they heard me, although I didn't say it, but maybe they heard me saying that
Sure.
it's, you know, you should have two parents, and it's, you know, you're damaged goods if you don't know. Of course, I don't even believe that, but my question to you is, when you teach your classes and you bring up the topic of, you know, the divorce revolution and
Sure.
and single families, single parent families, do you worry that what do you do about this? I'm sure you do worry about it, but how do you handle the fact that some kids are going to, many of your students, maybe more, these days more than half may come from broken families, and they may feel like the message that they're damaged in some way or shortchanged, and people don't really want to hear that. They don't want, and it may not even be true, maybe it is in some cases, and it might not be. So how do we convey this information without appearing to be telling people that they are, you know, their parents, you know, and that there's something wrong with them?
That's a great question. I think there are three things that I've experienced in the classroom that are helpful in this regard. The first thing is just, you know, I've been raised by a single mother, and I'm very clear about sort of saying I'm not judging, you know, people in that context. I've experienced this myself, you know, so that's helpful, I think, in terms of just sort of clearing the air to some extent.
Right.
A second thing is to actually point out, I quiz my kids anonymously. We have these little electronic clickers we can use in the classroom. I have large classes for some of the classes that I teach at UVA, about 200 students per class. And so in those classes, what we find is about 66% of those students are coming from intact, you know, married families.
Yeah, University of Virginia.
And so I point out to them, look, most kids your age in America are not coming from an intact married family. So you're exceptional, you know. usually both in terms of family income, but also in terms of family structure and why that matters. Why it is that their family structure may be one reason why they're actually sitting, in the classroom there at UVA. So I think that's also kind of they kind of get that point when they think about it. And then the third thing that I sort of would stress too is this idea that look, adults, we make a range of decisions. We can get divorced, we can have a child outside of wedlock. Any number of things can happen. But when we kind of think about what we want for our own children, I mean, most parents don't want their, kid to end up as a single parent or to end up divorced. And so I think we can generally agree that kind of most parents want the best for their kids when it comes to marriage and family life. And so, given that, what are some things that we can do in the economic arena, in the policy arena, in the cultural sphere, to increase the odds that the generation coming up now will be more successful in forging strong and stable marriages than was the generation that came up in the 60s and 70s.
Wouldn't it help if the media was simply a little more positive about marriage and about dads? I see men,
Sure.
dads, it used to be father knows best, and
Sure.
now it's like dad's a buffoon.
Although what's nice, some of
changing.
the ads so Dove has a great series of ads about dads that's both warm and and positive. There's Cheerios has a great peanut butter Cheerios, which is credible, great ad about sort of a contemporary father doing his thing, and it's just really, really positive. So I think that's changing a little bit. But I also think too, the media could be a lot more realistic about departures from the intact married family. We've done this actually on teen pregnancy with MTV's program 16 and Pregnant, but to kind of extend that insight into sort of later on, into the life course and how
that's a
kind of
good
the
idea.
breakdown of the family.
Just to be honest with
Yeah,
people.
look, I mean,
Not judging anybody,
yeah,
but this is the landscape.
It's more
This is what we
challenging.
know.
Yeah, right. And
And-
that's sort of, I think, papered over oftentimes in the pop culture.
Right. Well, this has been very enlightening, and thank you.
Thank you, Christine.